In our last video, we left off talking about the multiplier. And the multiplier basically lets us know that when there is an initial change in spending, let's say consumers feel pessimistic and they pull back a little bit and spending drops, the overall change in spending is going to be much larger due to this multiplier effect. Because once spending drops, that works its way through the economy, and the overall change is going to be greater than the initial change. That's what the multiplier process tells us. So again, the cumulative decrease in total spending is equal to the gap multiplied by the multiplier. The gap is basically the initial drop in spending. So a recessionary gap of $100 billion per year would decrease total spending by $400 billion. So in other words, this is the initial drop in spending. Again, consumers feel pessimistic. Spending drops by $100 billion. But that effect works its way through the economy, and then when the effect is completely done, it leads to an overall drop in spending of $400 billion per year. So we could, again, look at it in this way. Total change in spending is going to equal the multiplier, which is 1 over 1 minus MPC, multiplied by the initial change. And what we do this is we work its way through the economy, and eventually you lead to a $400 billion drop. So again, let's put this in the image we looked at before, the income circular flow. Here we have there's a $100 billion drop in spending in the product markets, right? And that leads, so businesses have unsold goods and services because there's a drop in spending. Well, they cut back on employment and they cut wages. Well, that's reduced income to households who cut spending. Now, they say their income drops by $100 billion, right? But do they cut spending by $100 billion? No, because there's some spending that's not dependent upon income. We call that autonomous spending. But spending still drops. In this case, it drops by $75 billion. But this causes another drop in sales for businesses, which they cut back on wages again. And you can see this reduces another round of income, and this process continues. This is the multiplier effect. And again, we don't have to go through each cycle to figure this out. We could do a very simple calculation, which is going to be the initial change in spending. Oops, sorry. Let me get rid of that line. Times the multiplier. And that's going to give us this number right here. So the decline in household income is caused by investment cutbacks, or it could not necessarily investment cutbacks. It could be other types of spending cutbacks. And this causes secondary shifts in the AD curve. Again, let's look at that from a AD curve point of view. So here we have AD 0, and this is where we want to be, right? Right here, $3,000 billion worth of spending on goods and services. But when there's a cutback on spending, that shifts the AD curve over to the left by $100 billion. But this is not the end effect, because then this starts a cascade of effects, the multiplier effect, and the overall shift is going to be much larger. It's going to really shift a total of a $400 billion, another $300 billion more over here. So output doesn't drop to this level. It drops to this level, the new equilibrium right here. And again, the difference between where we want to be and where we are in terms of the economy is the recessionary gap. that's assuming that where we want to be is a level of output above where we are. As long as aggregate supply is upward sloping, the shock of any AD shift will be spread across output and prices. And the recessionary gap is simply the amount by which equilibrium GDP falls short of full employment GDP. Again, let's look at this. Where do we want to be? Well, where we want to be is at full employment. This is where we want to be right here, full employment. But QE is where we are. So the difference between where we are and where we want to be, that's the recessionary gap. So in other words, how do we get equilibrium level of employment equal to QF? In other words, how do we move this over to here? Well, from a supply-demand point of view, we either have to shift the supply curve this way or the AD curve this way to get to here. So if we shifted the AD curve this way, right, AD1, shift it this way, do you see how the new equilibrium level of output is going to be equal to our goal? Now, conversely, if we shifted the AS curve this way, right, well, that's not a very good shift. This AS curve this way, right, we have a new level, equilibrium level output that's equal to our goal. We're going to be talking about this type of shift later on in the course when we talk about supply side economics. So the recessionary gap is the classic case of cyclical unemployment. If you remember in the employment chapter, we talked about there's 4 different types of employment. There's frictional, seasonal, structural, and cyclical. Cyclical is the worst type of unemployment. That's another way of saying there are too few job openings and too many job seekers. And that can happen when the economy is not generating enough activity to put everyone to work. So the shape of the aggregate supply curve, the AS curve, adds to the difficulty of restoring full employment. Why is that? Well, when the AD curve increases, both output and prices go up, right? So long as the short run aggregate supply curve is upward sloping, there's a trade-off between unemployment and inflation. Sometimes we call this the Phillips curve or Phillips relationship. Let's look at this. See how the AS curve is sloping upward? If we want to get more output, more economic activity by shifting the AD curve this way, look what happens. When we shift it, prices don't stay constant at QE. What happens is as you shift the AD curve this way, we move up the AS curve, and our new level of output is higher, but so is the inflation rate. That's the trade-off. So in other words, when output increases, unemployment falls, right? That makes sense. If you produce more, you put more people to work, so unemployment falls. But as you see here, inflation goes up. So if you want to drop in unemployment, the trade-off is higher inflation. So full employment, like I said before, that's the lowest rate of unemployment compatible with price stability. In other words, you want the unemployment rate to fall as low as it can, but if it falls too low, you can get inflation. And the reason why is if unemployment falls too low, that means you don't have any workers left over, right? Now, if you want to expand your output, how are you going to get workers? You're going to have to maybe try to get them from another employer. And how do you attract new workers? Higher wages. Higher wages leads to higher costs. Higher costs lead to higher prices. Higher prices is another example of inflation. So the closer the economy gets to its capacity, the greater the risk for inflation. So what we want is kind of that Goldilocks zone. We want the economy to be expanding rapidly, but not too rapidly. not so rapidly where you have a shortage of workers, which leads to higher labor costs, excessively higher labor costs, and then a spike in inflation. So neoclassical and monetarist economists do not accept this notion of full employment. In their view, as long as the AS curve is vertical, so that there is no unemployment trail. And in other words, they don't believe it looks like this. They believe the AS curve looks like this. AS. So an increase in investment spending shifts the aggregate demand curve to the right. That's one of the things that could shift it to the right. And when the AD increases due to increased investment, when the aggregate demand increases due to increased investment, available inventories start to shrink. And inventory depletion is a warning sign of impending inflation. So if you keep your track on inventories, if they fall too low, that could be a sign that prices are going to have to be raised because businesses are running out of product. So as investment increases, household incomes get a boost as producers increase their output to rebuild inventories and supply more investment goods. Now, consumers purchase more goods and services as their incomes increase. So this kind of starts a virtuous cycle. Good things cause other good things to happen. Eventually, consumer spending increases by a multiple of the income change. So the multiplier process in this case is working in the other direction. So the increase in aggregate demand causes both output and prices to increase. This increase in the average price level is known as demand pull inflation, and we covered this in the inflation chapter. And you could see that by when you shift the AD curve to the right, you get more output, right? See, output is increasing, but you also get higher prices. Prices start to go up. And that continues as the demand curve shifts to the right. So the price that you pay for more output is more higher prices in this case. So the basic conclusion of the Keynesian analysis is that the economy is vulnerable to abrupt changes in spending and behavior, and the economy won't self-adjust to the desired macro equilibrium. So that closes out our topic for the self-adjustment chapter.